A black man walks into a courtroom, but no one sees him. Not really. They look at him, but they don't see him. To most of the people in that room, he's already been labeled. A body, a color, a threat, maybe a clerk, maybe a witness, maybe someone lost. But certainly not someone who belongs in a position of power. Certainly not someone who commands a room like this. This is not a courtroom entrance. This is a psychological battlefield. Watch closely. He walks in wearing a plain suit, no entourage, no nameplate, calm posture, confident steps. But what follows is louder than any gavel. Silence that reeks of judgment. You can almost hear the internal narrative behind every smirk, every raised eyebrow. What's he doing here? He must be lost. Security will handle it. And in that moment, 100 years of social programming kick in. He hasn't said a word, and yet he's already been placed below the room, below expectation, below respect. But what no one knows is that this man is the reason this session even exists, and yet none of them can see it. Why? Because in spaces built by power, those who don't look like power are automatically discounted. That's where it begins. Not with violence, not with slurs, but with invisibility. And sometimes, invisibility is more violent than a slap to the face. This isn't a story about one man. This is a reflection of what happens in rooms every day, in offices, stores, airports, schools, places where skin color walks in first and identity comes second, if at all. If you've ever entered a space and felt smaller just by how people looked at you, you already know this story isn't fiction. It's just finally being said out loud. The man hasn't even opened his mouth yet. But already, the room is telling him who they think he is. They're about to learn how wrong they are. The man had barely stepped further into the courtroom before authority activated like a reflex. One officer, then two, flanked him, not with questions, but with commands. No context, no curiosity. Just cold protocol wrapped in prejudice. "Excuse me, sir. You're not allowed back here." A tone that wasn't about security. It was about putting him in place. He responded with composure. "I'm expected. I'm supposed to be here." But that only triggered suspicion. "Supposed to be where?" One officer barked, already resting his hand near the holster. It wasn't a question. It was a test, one they didn't expect him to pass. And that's the terrifying part. They weren't trying to protect the courtroom. They were trying to protect their perception of it. To them, the presence of this man, black, confident, unescorted, was a disruption of order. Because order, in their minds, had a color. And he didn't match it. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't loud. He wasn't violating a single rule. But when someone doesn't fit the unspoken mold, their existence becomes seen as defiance. They questioned him again, louder this time. One moved in front of him, blocking the path. Another gestured toward the door, not with guidance, but with warning, and the air thickened. This wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about domination. About making sure that everyone saw this man, not as a peer, not as an authority, but as an outsider being handled. And in that moment, the courtroom audience turned into spectators. Some leaned forward, others smirked. One pulled out their phone. Not to help, to capture. Humiliation in public is currency on the internet. And this man was becoming content without consent. He took a breath, and with the calm of someone who's seen worse than disrespect, he said, "You're making a mistake, a serious one." But in rooms where power means never having to apologize, mistakes are only visible after someone bleeds. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere? Simply for how you looked or walked in. Drop it below. You won't believe what happens next. As the confrontation unfolded, the room became a theater, not of justice, but of passive spectatorship. A dozen people sat on benches, some standing near the walls, some scrolling through phones moments earlier. Now all paused, watching. You could feel the shift. It wasn't outrage. It was something colder. A type of discomfort people feel when they know something's wrong, but don't want to be the one to say it, and so they whisper. Sheesh, they're really on him. Who is he anyway? Probably just another angry dude trying to act important. None of it said aloud, all of it poisoning the atmosphere. In moments like these, the room divides itself, not by roles, but by thresholds. There are those whose minds are made up before truth is even offered. There are those who notice the imbalance, but do nothing. And there are those who film it, not to help, but to have content for later. Because racism today doesn't always look like a burning cross or a slur shouted across a room. Sometimes it's a side eye. Sometimes it's a chuckle. Sometimes it's the way no one asks the obvious question. Why is he being treated like this? But in that courtroom, the whispers weren't just background noise. They were cosigns. Every smirk, every glance that said, "Here we go again," was another vote to let the humiliation continue uninterrupted. And here's the part people forget. Passive spectatorship is a weapon. Every moment you watch something unjust and choose to whisper instead of act, you're not neutral. You're just quiet enough to avoid guilt and loud enough to feed the cycle. He stood there, surrounded, and the whispers made it clear he was alone. No allies, no questions, only assumptions. Assumptions sharp enough to cut, silence loud enough to sentence, and a crowd comfortable enough to watch injustice unfold. As long as it wasn't aimed at them. What's worse, the aggressor or the silent crowd? Let's talk about the weight of complicity. Up until this point, what unfolded in that courtroom could have been explained away by some. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they're just being cautious. But then, one of the officers crossed the line. He didn't just block the man's path. He put hands on him. A firm grip on the shoulder, not to guide, not to assist, but to assert control. And then came the push. It wasn't violent enough to leave a bruise, but it didn't need to be. Because the point wasn't to injure. The point was to remind. You're not in charge here. You go where we tell you. You belong in our script, and right now, you're out of character. But what the officer didn't realize was that he was pushing a federal judge. The man turned to face him, not with rage, but with an unsettling calm. A calm forged from decades of being underestimated. You need to stop. Right now. You're making a grave error, he said evenly. But in environments where uniforms act before brains, warnings sound like resistance. And resistance, when wrapped in dark skin, gets treated as a threat. The second officer moved in. They were seconds away from taking him down. And right there, the line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. Because let's make something clear. If he hadn't been a judge, if no one had stepped in, that situation could have ended with a headline, not a story. A tragic misunderstanding, a non-compliant suspect, an unfortunate escalation. But the moment this officer made physical contact, he told the world, I don't need to ask. I don't need to listen. I only need to control. That's what systems of power look like when stripped of training, oversight, or accountability. They don't ask questions. They issue orders. And when those orders are challenged, the response isn't reflection. It's force. Should officers be punished for misidentification, when that misidentification is based on race? Your answer may say more about your world than mine. Just as the tension reached its peak, officers squared up, the crowd watching like spectators to a sanctioned humiliation. A new figure entered the courtroom. Not loud, not armed, just rushed. An assistant, young, pale, eyes wide. He moved like someone running from a fire only he could see, straight to the officer in charge. Whispered something in his ear. The reaction? Immediate and visceral. The officer flinched, like the words burned. His jaw tightened. His posture changed. You could almost hear the rewiring happening behind his eyes. Suddenly, the man in the suit wasn't just some guy. He was no longer a potential threat. He was no longer in the way. He was the judge. The man whose name was literally on the docket for that courtroom session. And just like that, the entire dynamic shattered. What had once been authority became apology. What had been suspicion became scramble. You could see the panic settle into their bones, not because they feared punishment, but because they realized who they had just tried to publicly humiliate. Here's the chilling truth. Nothing about the man changed. Same suit, same words, same calm tone. The only difference? They learned who he was, and that tells us something terrifying. Respect wasn't withheld because he was disrespectful. It was withheld because of what they assumed. The moment they could no longer afford to assume, they shifted. Which begs the question, what if he hadn't been a judge? What if he had no title to force that shift? That's the part they never answer. That's the part that makes the room itch. That's the part that tells you this was never about procedure. This was about power misfiring on sight and only reversing when status stepped in. And the most haunting moment? The man didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice, didn't even ask for an apology. He just walked forward and took his rightful place. As the room struggled to recalibrate itself, the man, the judge they had nearly removed by force, did something no one expected. He said nothing. No reprimand. No raised voice. No demand for apologies. He simply walked past the officers who had just manhandled him, approached the judge's bench, and took his seat. And that's when the room truly broke. The same people who whispered behind his back now sat in awkward, paralyzed silence. The officers, rigid, ashen, desperate to vanish. Even the bailiff looked unsure whether to speak or salute, because in that single moment, with no words, no spectacle, no retaliation, this man had exposed every cracked wall in that room's foundation. He didn't need to defend himself. His mere presence, seated in power, did what no viral clip, no press conference, no protest chant could do. It forced everyone to confront their own bias in real time. That's the brutality of this moment. It wasn't loud. It was clinical. It didn't demand attention. It commanded it. He sat there, calm, poised, still. And suddenly, the space felt unfamiliar to everyone else, because they weren't prepared to see a black man occupy that seat. They knew black judges existed. They knew equality was technically the law. But deep down, many of them had never actually witnessed it. Not like this. Not as a reversal of narrative. Not as a mirror they couldn't look away from. And that's when something extraordinary happened. People didn't just feel guilty. They felt exposed. Because in the courtroom, justice is supposed to be blind. But today, everyone saw exactly how sharp its vision can be when tinted with bias. Let's not lie to ourselves. If this man hadn't taken that seat, if someone hadn't revealed the truth, this would have ended with smug nods, jokes on the way out, maybe even a viral clip of a guy getting checked. But now everyone in that room had to sit in their shame. Have you ever had to prove your worth in a room where you were already qualified just because of how you look? This is your space. Say it loud. After the judge took his seat, no one knew what to do. The officers stood frozen, unsure if they should step back, apologize, or disappear entirely. The clerk shuffled papers just to have something to touch. The audience? Stone still. Some eyes wide, others glued to the floor. No one made a sound, because at that moment words were useless. There was no justification strong enough, no protocol polished enough, no excuse clean enough to erase what had just happened. And that's when it hit them. The courtroom, the officers, the bystanders. They had just tried to erase a man from power because he didn't look like power. And now that power was staring back at them, calm, black, unmoved. The silence grew heavy. It wasn't peace. It was the weight of a truth too inconvenient to speak. He didn't call them out. He didn't weaponize the moment. He just opened his notes, adjusted his papers, and said with the same measured tone he'd been using all along, "Let's begin." But for many in that room, the session had already begun, the moment they were forced to confront their own reflection. And that's what makes this silence louder than any scream, because everyone was now aware of themselves, of their bias, of their comfort with assumption, of their role in a system that almost degraded justice itself. Right before it was meant to be served, he didn't need to scream. He didn't need revenge, because dignity, when it refuses to fold, becomes the loudest force in the room. And here's the cruel irony. Had he shouted, they would have labeled him. But because he remained composed, they were forced to label themselves. Every courtroom has a verdict. But sometimes, the most damning judgment isn't for the accused. It's for the audience. After the silence settled and the judge began the session, something else began too, the internal reckoning. Every person in that room, from the officers to the clerks to the silent observers, was now a witness to their own bias. They had participated in a kind of soft violence, one that doesn't leave bruises but scars on dignity. And now they couldn't pretend it didn't happen. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a mirror held up without warning. Because if someone as composed, educated, and powerful as that man could be misjudged in seconds, what chance does a regular black man, without the title, without the robe, really have? And that's the knife that twists under the skin of the story. The only reason this incident stopped was because of status. Not humanity, not empathy, not fairness, just title. That's not justice. That's a transaction. And here's the real discomfort. What if he wasn't the judge? What if he had been a regular man, simply early to court? Would we be telling the story of another tragic arrest? Another body misunderstood? Another life misreported? This moment doesn't just expose the police. It exposes us, our tolerance, our silence, our assumptions. How often do we see videos like this and scroll past? How often do we justify it with, maybe there's more to the story? How often do we place doubt on the victim before we place accountability on the aggressor? That courtroom wasn't special. That moment wasn't rare. It just happened to be caught. Which means the real question isn't, how could this happen? It's, how often has it already happened when no one was watching? And here's where you come in. What would have happened if this man hadn't had power? And be honest, because that honesty, that's where change might begin. Also, if stories like this matter to you, if you believe they need to be heard, subscribe. Not for numbers, but because visibility is armor in a world that keeps trying to erase these voices. By now, if your pulse hasn't changed, you weren't really listening. Because this isn't about one incident. It's about the pattern. A pattern that repeats itself in airports, on sidewalks, in classrooms, in hospitals, and yes, in courtrooms too. And it repeats because the world forgets fast, unless we make it remember. That's why this channel exists. Not to go viral, not to chase outrage, not to perform wokeness, but to document what too many people try to delete. The truth of what it feels like to be unseen, until it's too late. Here we tell stories that don't make the evening news because they challenge the comfort of those who control the cameras. Here we highlight voices that aren't invited to panels, but have lived through fires most people couldn't survive. We don't glorify suffering, we honor it. We don't sell trauma, we protect memory. And if you believe in that, if you felt anything watching this unfold, if you thought, even for a moment, this could be my brother, my father, me, then you're not just a viewer. You're a witness with a choice. So here's the ask, and it's not random. Subscribe, not for content, but for conscience. Because every subscription pushes this truth into more feeds that usually filter it out. Every comment forces platforms to face what they'd rather bury. Every share turns a forgotten moment into a documented warning. In this courtroom, one man changed the atmosphere by simply sitting in the chair that was already his. You can change one too, by making sure this story isn't the last of its kind told here. When the judge wrapped up the court session, there were no fireworks, no media circus, no public apology. He simply stood, collected his things, and left. But the room didn't reset. Because when something this raw happens in a space built on order, the silence that follows becomes haunted. Every bench, every uniform, every pair of eyes in that room now carried something that couldn't be unsaid. They all saw it, and they all participated in action or in absence. And that's the truth we rarely admit. Most injustices don't end in a bang. They end in a hallway with a closed door and no one talking about what they just allowed. But this story didn't fade because you heard it. And now you can't unhear it. That's why this isn't just a video you watched. It's a verdict waiting for your response. You don't walk away from this and return to your scroll. You carry it, you reflect, you choose what kind of witness you'll be. Will you be the one who watches and whispers, or the one who refuses to let this keep happening in silence? Because if this man hadn't been a judge, if no assistant had walked in, if no one had spoken, would we even know his name? Would he still be standing? That's the final cut. If he wasn't a judge, what would have happened? The answers will tell us everything we need to know about the system and about ourselves. If this channel gives voice to stories that get buried, hit subscribe. Not because we ask, but because the world needs memory that doesn't depend on trending tabs. Because some stories shouldn't have to go viral to be believed. They just need to be heard by people who have the courage to listen. You're here. That says something. Don't let it stop at silence.